And thank you for joining us for this conversation today. My name is Omar Rodriguez. I am a professor in the practice of marketing at the Goizueta Business School, and I also serve as the academic director of education at the Roberto C. Goizueta Business and Society Institute. It's an academic research center with a mission to transform business to build a more equitable and climate smart world. I'm currently leading research into how brands communicate social and environmental benefits in social media and into the marketplace practices of what we call anti-racist brands. I also study how firms are evolving their marketing capabilities to compete in technology-led market environments. But today, it's really not about my work. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Erika Hall, Associate Professor of Organization and Management at Goizueta Business School, who also serves as faculty advisor at the Roberto C. Goizueta Business and Society Institute. And Dr. Hall's work has appeared in academic journals such as the Academy of Management Review, Journal of Applied Psychology, Psychological Science, and American Psychologist. And her work has been picked up by many media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, recently HBR and NPR. And in 2016, she was honored as one of the world's best 40 under 40 business professors by Poets and Quants. So we're honored to have her as part of our Emory faculty, and I'm personally excited to have the opportunity to have a conversation with her about her more research work. Her research focuses on the influence of race, gender, and class-based biases on interactions within the workplace and in the broader society at large. And today we're gonna talk to explore findings and implications from her work, particularly in the issue of racial bias. So good afternoon, Erika. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm excited. I'm excited to be doing this with you. So this is going to be fun.
No, same here. So you've done research to understand the unique role of racial bias in law enforcement and policing practices in particular. And in the paper you co-authored Black and Blue, Exploring Racial Bias and Law Enforcement in the Killings of Unarmed Black Male Civilians, which was published in the American Psychologist Journal. You provide a very clear overview of the different ways implicit bias can lead to some of the inequities in treatment experienced in the African American community, particularly by men. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit more about your research. What were some of the key findings and some of the solutions or recommendations that came out of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start from the beginning, which is why we actually did the paper. I was on the paper with Allison Hall from UTA and Jamie Perry from Cornell, and we're thinking about how we're sitting in this ivory tower, how we research things with a psychological basis, but that we're doing nothing to help our community in this way. And it was a little bit of a struggle, mainly for Allison, who's first author of the paper, that she wanted to be more active in trying to figure out how do we get rid of this racial bias? How do we eradicate what's happening in this phenomenon? And this followed Mike Brown's death and the uproar that happened after that. So we ultimately said, okay, our skills are that we know a lot about psychology and we know a lot specifically about industrial organizational psychology and implicit bias. Why don't we create a review that melds all this psychological knowledge that we have and applies it to the phenomenon at hand, which are the unarmed killings of Black men by the police. So the paper kind of helped her out in moving forward in academia. And specifically, we looked at two different things. We looked at racial bias, so implicit and explicit bias in society largely. And we also looked at distinct factors of the job of policing. So organizational factors, work-life factors that might come together and exacerbate these tensions between Black men and the police. So to go forward, if we looked at racial bias things as there's a stereotype of Blacks being more adult-like or Black youth being more adult-like. So there are some studies that suggest that when people perceive young Black boys, they perceive them as being almost 5 years older. Mm-hmm. So if we think of the death of Tamir Rice, also at the hand of police, we think maybe that could have factored in where Tamir Rice was 12 and they perceived him to be 20. So these ideas of Black youth being older mean that police necessarily could feel that they require more force or severe force in order to apprehend, because they're not necessarily children, they're adults, right? So there was one phenomenon that we kind of dissected. We also dissected this idea of Black people being both sub and superhuman. So subhuman meaning not quite a person, right? Which is where Black Lives Matter comes in, that slogan. And superhuman being so like a superhuman superhero character, like mystical, that any threat or force is not going to hurt them, right? So there have been studies in both regards. Subhuman, Melissa Williams, who's also at Goizueta Business School, has done studies with other co-authors where she's showed that Black people are implicitly linked to apes, right? And so the force that you might bestow on an ape or an animal, right, that connects to the force that people or police have shown brutality-wise. There's also the superhuman one where they show that if this mystical feeling that people have about Blacks being like superhuman characters, it requires more force to kind of disrupt that, right? So in the killing of Mike Brown, Darren, who was the police officer who killed him, said, I felt like he was like the Hulk coming down at me, right? This idea of this mystical superhuman character that needs excessive force in order to disrupt. I've been talking a while there, so
No. This is
take a break.
Yeah, and as I think your paper also goes into identifying possible solutions to mitigate or reduce the impact of these biases, that things that police departments could consider. What were some that come to mind now?
Sure. One that's specifically for police departments are rotational assignments. So one thing that psychological literature does show is that during this paradigm called the shooter bias paradigm, which is where they have people kind of like with a fake gun or often with keyboards decide to shoot somebody on a screen, and that person either is holding a cell phone or they're holding a gun. So if they're holding a gun, that's an actual threat, right? You would shoot them. If they're holding a cell phone, that's erroneous. And what they found is that people tend to shoot unarmed Black men more so than they shoot unarmed white men, right? So they've found this bias in shooter paradigms. One thing they've also done is they played with a lot of like training paradigms where they've put people in rotational assignments, which essentially means they'll have them in this scenario where they're looking at like a crime street or people with guns, and then have them in a scenario where they're looking at people who just need help getting their cat down from trees, right? And if it's diversified a little bit, where they're doing both things, where they are focusing on the cat in the tree as well as people in hardcore crime, then they find that link or that stereotyping linking Black people to criminality is muted, right? So rotational assignments, if you're every day your assignment is to go into the inner city and to go and dissect hardcore crime, and you never have an experience with the elderly citizen that needs your help for this, or somebody else that needs your help for this, then you're stereotypically going to link these two concepts of crime and Blackness, right? So rotational assignments where you do other things plausible. One of the things that we said was super important was that you get to, you try to dissect the problem and come up with solutions too late in the game, which essentially means that by the time we have the problem and we have this police force who has this tendency to do these things, to kill unarmed Black men, it's too late. We need to start when people are younger. And we suggest in the paper that it's not just police. community more broadly have racist tendencies or have implicit bias tendencies. So we need to attack people when they're a lot younger. Studies show that children are a lot more amenable to learning about racial stereotypes and being able to qualm their racial stereotypes. So why don't we go and incorporate this as an early education thing instead of waiting till adulthood when kind of your mind is more set and not as pliable, not as easy to change.
Fascinating, fascinating. And have you had organizations reach out to you to talk about your findings on this work?
Not so much on the findings of the police officers, because this was more of a review paper. So we took other people's research and kind of synthesized it and used it to explain some of the tensions that were going on. But my other work on labels has definitely attracted some attention from.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about that one. And I mean, you talk about the fact that these biases exist in culture at large, and part of that is promoted by the coverage we get from media. And I saw some of that in your more research work. So in this paper, you call "What's in the Name: The Hidden Historical Ideologies Embedded in the Black and African American Racial Labels." It was recently accepted in the Psychological Science Journal. In it, you and your co-authors find that, and in this I quote, "seemingly small linguistic choices made by activists or journalists can have considerable consequences for how the public interprets the meaning of news coverage." And I thought that was fascinating. Can you tell us briefly about how this latest research relates to your paper in 2015? And then what new insights are you bringing to the table with this latest work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper in question in 2015, I'll start there, essentially showed that the label Black was perceived to be more negative than the label African American by white Americans. The reason that this started was I noticed a tendency of any counterparts that I talked to want to call me African American when I identified myself as Black. So I thought maybe there's some stigma around there. Maybe there's something about the Black label that they think is a negative word, and investigate it. So we had some pretty stunning findings with that. One, in a hiring context where we had an application form that we gave to two groups of white Americans. The application form was identical for both of the groups, except for there's a little box that says race, and race was either identified as Black or was identified as African American.
Wow.
Now, when race was identified as Black, then 73% of the people felt like that person, when it was identified as African American, 73% of people felt like that candidate should be in a managerial position. When it was identified as Black, it was closer to in the 20s, the 20% child range. Same thing with salary. So in terms of salary, when it was identified as African American, then they thought the person would make like $37,000, I think it was. And when it was identified as Black, then they thought the person would make $29,000. So across the board, we found that identifying as Black was linked to or associated with low socioeconomic status, education, and negativity. And to me, I mean, I couldn't understand it. Like, I take pride in calling myself a Black person. It's the word that I prefer the most. So our second paper investigated what's behind this. Like, why is this label filled with this stigma? Why do people perceive it differently? And we found that these two labels are actually linked to past historical movements. So African American is most closely linked to the civil rights movement, and Black is most closely linked to the Black Power movement. And the ideologies that follow both of these social movements are embedded in these words. Now, distinctly, the Black Power movement had a rallying cry, which was essentially saying, like, look, things are bad here. We've been deprived, we've been impoverished, we've suffered racial bias. Things are not good around here, right? Where the civil rights movement was more kind of akin to, well, we need to advance and get our seat at the table. We need to have political participation in this world in order to advance within America, right? And so what we found is that white Americans in our study showed a more negative orientation to that ideology of the Black Power movement. And because that was linked to the word Black, we find those effects. But the one thing that I hold on to, because I'm still going to use this word Black, right? I still like it, right? It's unifying to me, is that people or white Americans who are interested in eradicating bias, racial bias, were more likely to donate money and funds and support a Black organization than an African American one. So we had the Black Alliance versus the African American Alliance. And it seems like that word Black is triggering, and that it triggers this kind of racial bias imagery in a way that African American doesn't connect with people, right? So I do feel like the label Black can help with the recognition of racial bias. That's a little bit more kind of impactful or strong or potent in a way that African American cannot.
So am I right to conclude then that the word Black entices more support from, let's say, the white community?
If you have the goal of eradicating racial bias, right, as a white American, yes, this is a more potent word, right? You were more drawn to the fact of this. And I mean, this also connects to like Black Lives Matter, right? The use of, I'm not sure, it's speculative, but would African American lives matter have as much impact? I'm not sure, but based on research, it seems like Black is a little bit more potent, a little bit more hard hitting and convincing of racial bias.
And when you think about the implications of this research on institutions that shape our culture, either media companies, marketing and messages, what are some of the ideas that come to your mind on how would you like these findings to be used?
Yes, absolutely. Well, one thing, when you just mentioned the media, it reminded me of a study that we actually did, two studies that we actually did to show how this does have an effect in the media. One was with visual media, which I thought was a particularly stunning finding. We went on Google Images, this is back in 2015, and we typed in Black or we typed in African American, and then we just looked at the images that resulted in the search. And we found that the images from the search of Black were related to more racial bias victimization, more negativity than were African American, where we got a lot more pictures of Obama, Martin Luther King, civil rights movement, which was interesting. The second finding that we had was we looked at 40 years of op-eds in the top 10, I think it was, outlets. So New York Times, Washington Post, so on and so on, US News and World Report. And we found that the use of the term Black was linked to more Black power ideology, race and bias ideology within those particular articles, opinion articles, and the use of the term African American was linked to more civil rights and equality ideology. So more terms surrounding that particular ideology within those op-eds. So you see that even the use of the terms kind of correlates with this overall tone that's in the media that can either convince people either way based on the term that is used. So I thought that was particularly profound. But one thing that I think media outlets are doing, I believe that it's the Washington Post, is allowing their subjects to voice what particular label they want to be used to identify them, right? Because it's not that either of them are inherently bad. We learned from the Black Power movement, we learned from the Civil Rights movement, and they both had a tremendous impact on history. It's how do I want to define myself, and shouldn't I get the choice of how I'm defined, right? So one thing is that we're typically other labeled. So people will refer to us and say like, oh yes, she's a Black woman or she's an African American woman, right? but that doesn't give me the choice in the ideologies that I'm associated with and the stereotypes that are conjured up when these words are used.
Mm-hmm.
So I do like the fact that some media outlets have given subjects within their articles the choice of how they want to be defined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. I mean, it is particularly relevant also in communities where there is intersectionality of these identities, right? Particularly, I have many Black Latino friends
Yeah,
that
yeah,
before they came to our country, they never thought of themselves as African Americans,
sure.
right? So I think that that topic continues to be one that needs further exploration. Now, your research has helped uncover some of the seeds of racial bias. What are a few things that you have in mind in terms of what's needed to eradicate it? What are some suggestions or ideas you want to leave us with for how can we individually or collectively work to eliminate or eradicate racial bias?
Yeah, and that's the money question, right? It's easier to kind of study that these biases exist, harder to figure out how to eradicate them. But in general, I think that awareness is important. One thing that we're typically resistant to is thinking of ourselves as bad people. Like, I'm not a racist person, I'm not a bad person. And so you don't want to investigate those introspective aspects of yourself that might be leading toward an implicit bias. As a psychologist that studies these things, I think everybody's biased. I think I'm personally biased, right? And the sooner that we kind of accept that these biases exist in our decision making and in our natural life, and that it doesn't make us a bad person necessarily, it just means that throughout our lives, we have these associations that have either come from the media or have come from stories or tales or gossip that we automatically connect, right? But we can disassociate from our implicit biases. If we're conscientious of the fact that we have these biases, and we also have these egalitarian values, studies have shown that our egalitarian values can kind of overpower our implicit biases in our decision making, but we have to be conscious and aware, right? So, I mean, that's why I love talking about implicit biases and this research, because I do think it highlights the awareness so people can take control of some of the things that happen automatically in cognitive processing and make deliberate decisions about who they want to be, who they want to perceive, and how they want to decide on other people's outcomes.
That's powerful. So we're not at the mercy of these biases. If we recognize them, we make them salient, we can let more of who we really want to be show up in the world.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So Erika, what are you working on next? What are some new areas of inquiry that you're passionate about and we can wait to learn about in a few years?
Absolutely. So one thing that you brought up was intersectionality, which is kind of just the cross-cutting of different subordinate demographic identities. So when we talk about race and gender, or gender and age, and layers on oppression. So one of the things that I've been working on is trying to tease out how these different demographic identities combine to influence how we're perceived. So I've gone down that road. But then I've also wanted to focus on this labeling work because there are a ton of other labels that we use, right? That come up. You talked about the Latino population. Latinx is one that's readily used. Is that one that's appreciated? Is there something that's embedded in it stereotypically? The same with other labels that are used, right? Like Hispanic for one. Is there something undergirding that? So I want to look at these different racial and ethnic labels and see how they are influencing perceptions of the people that they label.
Fascinating. One last question. As those of us listening to you are interested in learning more, is there any particular book or article or even paper that you recommend we read to just keep ourselves knowledgeable about these subjects?
That's a good question. I can't point to a particular book, but in terms of my research, is actually all on the Goizueta website.
Okay.
So if they ever want to see any of these papers, then absolutely, you could do that. Some of the more fun reading is
Your research is a lot of fun, but yeah.
I appreciate that. Ones that are a little bit less scientific and more kind of the op-eds that I've done or any articles that have been about my work. And so that's also on the website as well.
Good. All right. Well, thank you again for making time to join me today in this conversation. And it was been fascinating to learn about your work to date and what you're interested in the future. Thank you, those of you that have joined us. And I think we'll call it a day for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.